I'm indeed very excited to be here and introduce you to a topic that is extremely close to my heart in terms of how we can build effective alliances between people and institutions, and how do we actually drive the topic that this forum is all about around equity and inequality. So through this panel, for which we have 4 outstanding panelists, we are going to be exploring the internal and external changes that alliances between institutions and between individuals need to build to bring about changes in the practices, beliefs, and underlying values that shape behaviors and actions, not just in civil society, but in society at large. So joining me today in this discussion are 4 outstanding panelists. First, Dato Dr. Ahmad Faizal Muhammad. Dato Dr. Ahmad obtained his Bachelor of Medical Sciences in 1989 from University Kebangsaan, Malaysia, followed by his master's degree in internal medicine in 2000. He was accredited as a respiratory physician in 2003 and is now attached to KPJ Damansara Specialist Hospital as a consultant physician. Dato Dr. Ahmad joins us today by virtue of his involvement with Mercy Malaysia, where he is the president of Mercy Malaysia. And his involvement with Mercy Malaysia began in 2003 when he signed on as a volunteer. He was made a member of Mercy Malaysia's Executive Council in the same year and headed the Drug Rehabilitation and Assistance Program in Malaysia from 2003 to 2006 before being elected as president in 2010 after acting as an interim president since August 2009. He was re-elected as president in 2011, and in 2014, he was also appointed to the Board of Trustees for Mercy Malaysia, UK. Professor Dato Dr. Ahmad's tours of duties have included Sri Lanka, Iran, Sudan, Indonesia, Pakistan, Myanmar, Syria, and the Philippines. Welcome, Dato Dr. Ahmad. Joining Dato Dr. Ahmad is Puan Zakiah Jaafar, the Deputy Secretary General of Treasury, looking after policy in the Ministry of Finance, Malaysia. Puan Zakiah is currently the Deputy Secretary General, and she joined the civil service in 1981 and spent the first 28 years of her career at the Economic Planning Unit. At the Economic Planning Unit, she held various positions and portfolios, including macroeconomic framework, knowledge-based economy, and public sector housing. Puan Zakiah was once seconded to the Islamic Development Bank in 2006 as a research assistant to support Tun Mahathir Mohamad as the chairman of the Vision 1440H Council under the bank. She has led the preparation of the 11th Malaysia Plan, which was there between 2016 and 2020, and conceptualized the 12th Malaysia Plan, which will last from 2021 to 2025. In late 2019, she joined the MOF, initially covering government strategic investment, government investing companies, as well as management of public assets and statutory bodies. In her current position at MOF, she now oversees national budgeting, tax policy, fiscal and macroeconomics management, and credit reporting agencies. Welcome, Puan Zakiah. It's a pleasure to have you here. Joining them is Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who's the Senior Research Advisor at the Khazanah Research Institute. Prof. Jomo is also the Fellow of the Academy of Science in Malaysia, the Emeritus Professor at the University of Malaya, a visiting fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University, and a visiting professor at the International Islamic University in Malaysia. Prof. Jomo has been a member of the Economic Action Council, chaired by the Malaysian Prime Minister between 2019 and 2020, and was in the 5-member council of eminent persons appointed by him between May to August 2018. Prof. Jomo has always also been the professor at the University of Malaya between 1986 to 2004 and an independent member of the National Economic Consultative Council. He's been the president of the Malaysian Science Association, the founding convener of the International Malaysian Studies Conference, and the founder chair of the International Development Economics Associates, along with the UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs from 2005 till 2012, and the research coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development. Thank you so much for joining us, Prof. Jomo. Finally, last but not the least, it's a great pleasure to welcome Mr. Leong Cheung, the Executive Director, Charities and Community for the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Besides being the Executive Director of Charities and Community at the Hong Kong Jockey Club, Leong is also the co-chair of the Hong Kong chapter of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Prior to joining the club, Leong was the operating partner with Bain Capital in Hong Kong. Before that, he was the managing director of the global sourcing and supply chain at the Esquel Group, the founder and CEO of an education-focused internet venture, and a senior consultant at the Boston Consulting Group. Leong is also the co-founder of an innovative social enterprise, Run Our City. Welcome to all of you, and I hope we are going to look forward to an insightful and engaging discussion where we hope that we can have the audience participate through questions put in the chat box. So I would like to start by asking Dato Professor Dr. Ahmad Faizal to do his presentation. The way this panel is going to run is each of my panelists will do a brief presentation on their program, on their organization, and then we will follow this up with me starting out with some questions that I have for them, and then opening it up to the audience for their questions. So, Dato, Dr. Ahmad, can we start with you, please?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and a very good morning, everyone. Thank you to your son Hasanah for inviting Mercy Malaysia to come on board this very important and very critical platform at this very critical juncture, both for the world as well as for Malaysia. So I am going to go and jump directly into the topic given and also the relevance to our organization, which is Mercy Malaysia. We are focusing, of course, on building effective alliances. And for us in civil society, that means effective alliances for more empowerment and for meaningful functional space, without which alliances have no meaning for us. And there is also that issue of equality and equitability, which the moderator spoke about. And here we'd like to bring about a concept of civil society equality and equitability in the delivery of aid. And from Mercy Malaysia's perspective, I'll share a little bit here and there of our experiences in humanitarian action, in the pandemic response and preparedness, as well as in poverty eradication. And I guess the main questions will be, is there enough space and enough equity and enough investment in both civil society and in community? And whether there are meaningful partnerships. We are convinced, however, that going forward, that alliances are the way forward, with a caveat, of course, that that they should be meaningful and equitable. From charity to justice. Next. Next, please. Yes. So some principles and important points only. I'm just using the slides as a guide. Charity to justice sounds like a very big theme, and it's indeed very laudable for the organizers to bring this forth. But, you know, it actually requires a major paradigm shift, not only in individuals, but also in organizations. And the paradigm shift is at multiple levels, yeah? There has to be a paradigm shift in mindset. There has to be a paradigm shift in approach, in attitude, in methods, in objectives, and in ultimate aims, without which we're just talking. Charity, as we understand it, especially in the East, is very much about giving and giving to those in need. But there is an element, when there is an element of justice put in, charity becomes not just something that we give, but it has to be given with deep thought. It has to be given with afterthought. It has to be given with planning. It has to be given with understanding of the consequences of what we give, to whom, why, etc. And so justice in the context of charity to justice, especially in giving aid to those in need in crises, whether it be a natural disaster, man-made conflict, a pandemic, has to be seen as justice that is also there and present in planning, justice that is present in its inclusivity, not just in the delivery of whatever assistance we give, but also in the strategizing, in the planning, in the funding. Yeah? There has to be justice in the needs, and there has to be justice in the implementation and the outcome of whatever we do. Now, that's a big ask, because then we're just not talking about charity per se. We're also talking about the consequences. And justice here means both at individual as well as community and at national level. So social justice as a whole. And aid and assistance must encompass both the emergency and immediate. As we've seen during the lockdowns during the pandemic, people run out of food, they must be given food. But in charity to justice, short, medium and long-term needs of affected and vulnerable populations, and of course in this age of climate change, of the environment and of the surrounding ecology, must be taken into account. You cannot just give immediate food aid without talking about food security. We cannot just give food aid without talking about livelihoods, about what next for these vulnerable communities. And here comes the other important principle and point, I guess, for this whole forum, which is no one person, no one entity, no one group, no one organization, no one government, as the pandemic has shown, and no one corporation can do it all on their own. And nobody, not even the biggest, most powerful governments in the world, not even the most developed countries in the world, have been able to face up to COVID-19, for example, on its own. If there was one blessing out of this pandemic, it's that. It's the realization that humanity has to realize that on our own, we are just very small dots. And something as small but as lethal as the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 can disable mankind. And while relief is crucial in emergency situations, sustainable solutions and resilience building is in all circumstances will actually determine the eventual success or failure of any intervention, any programming that we do, any assistance that we give. So again, while in emergency situations, it is very important, very crucial for us to deliver. So during the pandemic, for example, Mercy Malaysia assisted the Ministry of Health in Malaysia at three very important junctures, both in 2020 and 2021, when there were surges and peaks, in the numbers of cases and number of deaths, when our ICUs were overwhelmed. We initiated a hospital surge capacity program. We've also, since March 2020, initiated a psychosocial and mental health support helpline together with the Ministry of Health, even before the surge in suicides earlier this year. But of course, both these measures are examples of what good we do during emergencies, but we do need to prepare for the next step. And what comes next? Our public hospitals need to be refurbished, need to be enhanced, need to have their capacities increased, both in manpower, in resources, in equipment. Our mental health and psychosocial support programs, no matter how good they are now, will not suffice for the long term. There needs to be an understanding of what drives and what are the triggers and the factors that cause all these mental health and psychosocial problems and issues in the community, without which the intervention programs are just a drop in the ocean. And sustainability, of course, in financial terms, it's one thing to give cash aid, and we do with some of our partners, give cash aid to the poor, especially during the lockdowns. But again, as I've said earlier, we do need to look at livelihoods and what comes after. As of 30th of September, yesterday's announcement in Parliament is that 3.6 million Malaysians have now got less than 1,000 ringgit in their EPF accounts, out of the 6 million Malaysians who have less than 10,000 ringgit in their EPF accounts. Partly because of the of the withdrawals during which were allowed during the pandemic. But it speaks of a bigger problem, actually. The amounts that were there in the first place were hardly enough, which explains why the numbers now are so low. Yeah, so there has to be a more sustainable solution, a sustainable look at that. So a wholesome and holistic understanding of the situation and of the affected communities is crucial, even if the agency or entity works only in a particular area. So even if a certain foundation, for example, wants to do only food security, it has to understand the health sector picture, has to understand the mental health problems, it has to understand the economic problems that surround food security, etc., etc. Next, please. And so we have this thing called the civil society space or civic space. So what is it? It's actually the environment that enables civil society to play a role in the political, economic, and social life of our societies and communities. Now, when we say this, it does not mean, of course, that there is a connotation of perhaps of going down to the streets here, yeah. But that's not necessarily the case. This is talking about allowing people, ordinary human beings or ordinary members of society, to actually do good, to do public good. And of course, when there's enough tension in any society, people do sometimes go to the streets, but that shouldn't be the first thing that comes to mind. We should allow civic space for good to be done, and I think for the majority of people, if the space is there to do good, they will do good, and good outcomes will be there. So there needs to be recognition of both rights-based as well as needs-based approaches. I think the time has come for while we look at each country as a unique environment, we also have to recognize again that humanity is the same wherever we are. I know that sounds very idealistic, yeah, but everybody wants the same things. Now, there has been this eternal debate about Western values and Eastern values, yeah, and a rights-based approach and a needs-based approach. The answer is actually a balance between the two, between East and West, between rights and needs. Yes, we have to recognize there are rights, without which, women will continue to be abused, yeah, children will continue to be trafficked, poor children, that is, yeah, the poor will remain poor or become even poorer, as for example, as a result of the pandemic, yeah. So there is a space for a rights-based approach. But on the other hand, there is space for a needs-based approach as well. We do need to give priority to those most in need, those who are most affected by a particular crisis. And this is something which Mercy Malaysia and other credible humanitarian organizations do anyway. But I guess the recent pandemic has brought this out to the fore. And effective partnerships, of course, this is where effective partnerships and alliances come in, can help create those effective civic space, as different partners can unlock different aspects related to both the community as well as different levels and types of authority. Now, when we talk about space, sometimes we think that only the government is the impediment, yeah? Only government and authority are the ones who stand in the way. That's not entirely true. Sometimes communities themselves are a problem. Yeah? Communities can be very closed, can be very insular, can be very inward-looking, can refuse aid for a number of reasons. Yeah, and so alliances help, because in alliances, partner A can perhaps use its good offices with a particular local government. For example, partner B may be able to use its links with the national government. Partner C may be able to use its affinity with the affected community, yeah, and all come together to do good. If only one entity was doing it, they will have problems with the other two entities that we just spoke about, yeah. So this is where alliances come in, and this is what I mean by unlocking key aspects of different aspects, however, of both community and authority. And the current global and national scenario during and post-pandemic that we are currently going through, as well as the advent of multiple compounding hazards and risks, brings a higher amount of significance and value to effective alliances working together. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in a world where the pandemic, where COVID-19 has just woken us up. has just given us a knock on the head. For those of us who are still sleeping, I would suggest that we wake up. COVID-19 is just a precursor of what may come next. And here we are, just a few days after the end of COP26 in Glasgow, which was hardly encouraging, yeah, although there were some encouraging moments. And so we must look forward to the next few decades where the effects and compounding impact of climate change will come together with more epidemics and pandemics, yeah, with natural disasters made worse by the impact of climate change, by poverty, by migration, by displacement of people, both by conflicts and by climate change, which is already happening. So all this will bring an impact on supply chains, on businesses, and on the bottom line, like it or not. And this is where alliances need to come together. Next, please. And communities and civil society will be stronger together in alliance. And because again, people closest to the problems will be able to deliver better usually, but we'll be able to deliver better if we have inputs from more well-resourced entities like donors, like partners, like Hasanah, like Khazanah. Yeah. So I put it to you that the often said acronym of PPP, private-public partnership, is now better if it's PPACCP. I know it's a bit long, with community as one of the C's at the center. So it's public, private, academia, civil society, community partnership. It has to be there. Academia plays a very important role. We usually forget. So my good friend, Prof. Jomo, who represents that segment here, knows very well the importance of academia in these endeavors. And I'll be very quick now with my last few points. Each element must recognize each other's strengths and weaknesses, which I think we do, yeah, but we don't put them together sometimes. Coordination is necessary, of course, but coordination must not be at the expense of the effectiveness of delivering the aid or the assistance. Sometimes that happens. And the most vulnerable must always be at the foremost of aims and objectives, and where possible, included in the planning stage. So communities and civil society should be included. Governments sometimes like to include us only after decisions have been made, yeah, which is not the way to go. Next, please. And this is my last slide. So building effective alliances will mean more resources can be brought to bear, more effective programming with a combined approach, better, wider, deeper advocacy on important issues. Yeah, one voice sometimes doesn't make it. Yeah, 3 voices make it a lot stronger. It makes more sense sometimes. Better empowerment for affected communities, more holistic and at the same time more effective solutions, and increased cost effectiveness leads to more cost savings actually, which then can allow both foundations as well as corporate partners, as well as governments, as well as civil society organizations to do more in other areas for more people, for more communities, and resilience that will be built. We don't have time to talk about resilience in depth now, but resilience that will be built will be multifold and synergistic. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dato. I think that you brought up some extremely important points in that presentation. You know, talking about both charity and justice that needs to be present right from the beginning in planning, to look at how effective the alliances can be, not just having alliances, but effective alliances, to looking at the space of civil society and civic society. And most importantly, the point that no one person, no one group, and no one government can do it on their own. And the fact that post this pandemic, we are looking down not just at poverty alleviation, but the whole, you know, sort of effects of climate change, of food security, and all of that needs to be discussed now with a renewed sense of urgency and purpose. Let me now ask Puan Zakiah if she would like to give us her presentation. Puan Zakiah, over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Naina, and to Yayasan Hasanah for inviting us. Assalamualaikum and good morning, fellow panelists and ladies and gentlemen. I'm the token government rep here to deliberate our challenges in improving public service delivery. But before I do that, some mandatory words from the sponsor. I still have to earn my job selling budget 2022. So a quick rundown on that before going to the crux of the matter, just to put things in context. In the next slide, on the left-hand side, which shows our economic growth, alhamdulillah, it does look like we are at the tail end of this crisis. Economic recovery is gaining traction, but with 2 years of economic losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it will be a challenge to reach a high-income nation status and ensure inclusivity as envisioned in the 12 Malaysia Plan. On the right-hand side, which shows our labor market, our unemployment is moderating, but issues of underemployment, graduate unemployment are still a concern. Nevertheless, we see more skilled jobs being offered in the market. So this will somewhat ease the situation, but we need to ensure that the structural change is organic so that it is sustainable. I do have some bad news in the next slide. The pandemic brought forth many of our structural problems that can be impediments to a more inclusive and sustainable development, making growth less meaningful. Given the time limit, I'm just showcasing 3 here. You can find the rest in the 12th plan. First stop, the leftmost chart shows who benefits from GDP growth, either the capitalists or the workers. For the first time, Ministry of Finance publishes GDP by income estimates, and the share of compensation of employees is expected to stagnate at 37% of GDP in 2022, way below that of advanced and emerging economies. For instance, 40% for Singapore, 47% for South Korea, and 51% for Canada. Secondly, the middle table shows women participation, or rather the lack of it in Malaysia, variables of which show so much room for improvement. That caused our ranking in the Gender Equality Index by the World Economic Forum to drop 8 places this year, even below Myanmar, for heaven's sake. And finally, the rightmost charts show some of our performance in SDGs related to the environment, trend of which needs to be reversed, certainly. Next slide, please. I'll be the first to admit that government doesn't know it all, and it is not the best in everything. In the 1980s, under the Malaysia Incorporated concept, we alleviate the status of the private sector as the engine of growth. We created a conducive environment for the private sector to bloom, and bloom they did. So much so that private investment now makes up 75% of total investment in the country and complement the public sector in delivering quality services in health, education, transport, and other infrastructure and facilities. But time and time again, in this crisis and other situations, we saw how the civil society complements the government in delivering public services more efficiently and reach the targeted groups. Thus, in Budget 2021, we announced that the civil society should be our key development partner. In Budget 2022, this role is further elevated in the form of a triple helix collaboration, aligned to the call of our coming together as one Keluarga Malaysia. So you will see how initiatives in Budget 2022 are curated to incorporate government, GLCs, private sector, and NGOs wherever possible in delivering assistance, social protection, jobs, business support, and green initiatives, among others. The next slide shows a summary matrix of Budget 2022 focus areas and main initiatives across its main beneficiaries. Of course, Budget 2022 will still focuses on ensuring recovery will be fully entrenched. So our initiatives are still on extending targeted assistance to those vulnerable groups and sectors that are still badly hit. With the full opening of the economy next year, inshallah, we target 600,000 jobs to be created to ensure we're back to full employment. And to support businesses to restart, a lot of financing assistance will also be provided. But Budget 2022 also focuses on building our resilience as the war against pandemic and future disasters is, it's not over yet. So the health sector is given greater focus. So does the education and housing sectors. We also focus on our enablers, albeit technology or financing to support growth. And finally, Budget 2022 is fully aligned to the 12th plan, the medium-term plan, and seed the initiatives and for reforms in many areas, such as fiscal reforms, bridging regional development gap, and evolving into a greener economy. The next slide shows a sample of financial initiatives to ensure recovery and inclusivity in recovery. You'll notice that for so long, many of these initiatives focus on the micros and SMEs, and rightly so, because they're the most affected with grants, microcredits, and soft loans. But this time around, assistance is also extended to bigger enterprises through equity and alternative financing. Social enterprises are given a special focus in Budget 2022, as they have proven to be an important agent to promote, encourage and make social change. Not only that, we also observe in benchmark countries, social enterprises are very sustainable and not that susceptible to economic cycles. In the UK, for instance, the social enterprises accounts for 3% of GDP, employs 5% of people in work, is 3 times larger than agriculture and as important as the creative services. So we should fulfill their potential to be a force of nature in future. Next, it is a stylized fact that what is good for women is good for all. For instance, many studies have shown eliminating the gender gap in Malaysia will add an 8 percentage point in GDP growth and 26 percentage point in income per capita. So improving the lot of women, this slide shows the new and improved initiatives under Budget 2022. These are, of course, in addition to existing initiatives. They may not amount to much because of our limited fiscal space, but it's a start. Those colored in red are initiatives that have collaborations in NGOs. So the initiatives cut across the dimensions of improving livelihoods of women, as women are the worst hit in this and any crisis. Childcare is also given focus to help ease its costs and hopefully also to release more women into the labor force, raising the labor participation rate and alleviate the nation's productivity. Greater women empowerment will also be supported, where all public listed companies will have to have at least one female director. All is not lost here. Empirical evidence does show that companies who have gender diversity recorded 25% above average profitability in the top quartile. But sadly, the recent crisis showed that women suffered more physically and mentally. So there are a number of major initiatives in Budget 2022 to address safety and health issues for women as well. And by the way, our annual budget is now fully aligned to all the SDGs, one of only 10 countries in the world which has done so. In moving forward, we will be working on a gender-responsive budget to ensure that initiatives for women's empowerment is adequately funded. And lastly, what began in Budget 2021, next please. Budget 2022 has a more substantive sustainability agenda. We are very mindful that our GHG emissions is barely 0.8% of global emissions, but 70% of Malaysia's exports goes to trade partners that have sustainability targets. And allocators of capital are now focusing more on sustainable investment. For years now, we have been offering carrots for our industries to evolve, to become greener and more sustainable, but not that many have taken the bite, so progress is not as fast as we like. Now the stick is coming from external and internal. So companies should grab this opportunity to make the change whilst we are given the respite before the stick actually hits us. Listed below are some of the main initiatives in our sustainability agenda. Again, the ones in red are our collaborations with NGOs to drive them. These initiatives are to encourage industries to adopt low carbon practices, protect our environment and biodiversity, and empower our communities in our sustainability agenda. Given our success in issuing the world's first sovereign sustainability dollar sukuk in April, the government is planning to issue its ringgit sustainability sukuk next year to finance more social and green projects. In moving forward, our budget will also be extended to green budgeting. So let me stop here, Ms. Naina. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Zakiah, and very many congratulations on presenting a budget that is both gender aligned as well as has a sustainability lens and is fully aligned with the SDGs. I think that is definitely a big start. Yes, there is a lot to be done, and I think it's also really encouraging for everyone in the audience to hear that civil society and the non-profit sector is going to be given a lot more importance and impetus as Malaysia looks at growing more and growing more inclusively going forward. So thank you so much for your sharing. Prof. Jomo, can I now actually invite you to come in and share some thoughts with us, please?
Thank you very much, Madam Batra, and thank you to Yayasan Hasanah for kindly inviting me to join you today. Now, I think it's very useful for us to reflect on what we have heard this morning. Very importantly, we have been reminded that charity is love, philanthropy is love. But unfortunately, the reality of what are called charities and philanthropy is otherwise. We often see that, for example, in the West, the foundations are used as tax evading devices. So as a consequence of this, we have seen how in a sense, the institutions which have been created in the name of charity and philanthropy have actually undermined justice. And this is, I think, the challenge which we face today. I want to address a specific issue which has been posed to me, and that is what does it mean to have a just and equal Malaysia? Now, this might seem to be a very contested issue, and it's very important for us to reflect on our own history as we go along. This year, for example, is the 500th anniversary of the death of Magellan, who often is portrayed as a man who wanted to go around the world and so on and so forth. And he was killed in Mactan Island in the central Philippines in 1521. Now, before that, a decade before that, he had participated in the conquest of Malacca, and he had taken a slave, and the slave which was subsequently named Enrique. Now, I think it's very important for us to recognize that the inequities and inequalities in the world today are those which have been historically derived, and they have to do a lot with what we call globalization today, history of imperialism and colonialism and transformation. There has been a great deal of injustice and a great deal of efforts to protect that injustice through various means, including the colonial sponsorship of ethno-populism. Now, after the war, we see in Malaysia at the time when, say, India was getting independence, Pakistan was partitioned and got independence, and so on and so forth. In this country, those who were fighting for independence at that time, led by an organization called Pokemam, created an alliance which came up with the so-called People's Constitution, demanding independence and justice. So we have a commendable history in this country of that type of cooperation to build a new nation. Unfortunately, that was betrayed very early on. The constitution, which many of us are often proud of, was essentially a constitution which continued to protect the colonial interests to a great degree. And this was recognized by the late Tun Razak, our second prime minister, who then went about trying to retrieve much of the properties which had been obtained by imperial powers. Basically, properties which actually rightly belonged then Malaya and then subsequently Malaysia had to be bought back on the London Stock Exchange and so on and so forth at considerable cost. So consider the irony. Properties which actually belong to this country had to be bought back through so-called neutral market mechanisms. Now, in the whole process, of course, Malaysia was created in 1963. And it's important to remember that right from the outset, there has been contention over the whole question of the terms and conditions under which Sabah and Sarawak participated in the new federation. And this led to the removal of the first chief minister of Sarawak, Stephen Kalong Ningkan, because he resisted the federal takeover of the continental shelf. Now, the next watershed, which is very important for the history of this country, was 1969. And it's to the credit of the country and Tun Razak that he had the vision to create a national consultative council and to return to parliamentary rule as soon as possible. And part of this new social contract, as often people refer to it, involved the Ruku Negara, and also, very importantly, other conditions for national unity, including the new economic policy. Now, this was, of course, very commendable. Eradicating poverty and restructuring society is something which is very commendable. And I think restructuring society has a long history in different parts of the world, including beginning in colonial India, for example, against the caste differences and other differences involving the so-called scheduled tribes and so on and so forth. Likewise, we have seen how Martin Luther King and others fought for affirmative action and so on. But we have also seen the betrayal of affirmative action, the betrayal which led to the acquisition of considerable wealth. The Black economic empowerment, which is supposedly inspired by new economic policy, has subsequently led to the creation of a number of African billionaires in South Africa. But the vast majority of Black South Africans, their conditions of life have not significantly improved. So the whole question of national unity was not sufficiently well addressed in this conception. And it's very important for us to recognize that Tun Razak as far back as 1972, almost half a century ago, created the Social Security organization, which had a vision of extending what we now call social protection to much of the population of the country. Now, moving on very quickly, I think the next watershed, as Malaysians know, comes with the end of the NEP period in 1971. In 1990, and in 1991, Tun Mahathir announces his Vision 2020, a vision which I think reiterated many of the aspirations of the Ruku Negara and the NEP, but went further and explicitly committed the country to creating a Malaysian nation, a Bangsa Malaysia. This was something which was aspired to in the People's Constitution in 1947, but unfortunately remains a slogan because many of the contending forces are not committed to this. So we have continued more than half a century after independence. We continue to have problems of ethno-populism in this country, and the promotion of victimhood as opposed to a more progressive type of populism. And this, I think, is a choice which many of us face in this country. Moving on very quickly, I think it's useful for us to consider the sustainable development challenges which we face in this country. These have been alluded to by other speakers already, both Dato Zakiah as well as Dato Faizal. And this is extremely important, the balance between the economic, the social, and the environmental, or the ecological. But we see this being undermined, greed versus sustainability. For example, in one of the states, in Kedah State, let me be very straightforward about it, we have seen in the last 5 years, the cancellation of planting seasons for rice in two years. This cancellation took place, sorry, not 2 years, 2 seasons in 5 years. That is 20% of the rice output gone because of inadequate water supply in the Perdaus catchment area, which basically provides the water for Kedah. And what do we see? Most recently, the Chief Minister has approved further logging in that water catchment area, which will further jeopardize this. So we see that greed, I don't want to say it's corporate greed in particular, but greed is certainly at odds with the human condition, at odds with the possibility of sustaining, of improving the human condition. Let me I think that Faizal and others have already spoken very eloquently about the challenges which we have faced. In many ways, COVID-19 has exposed many things. It has accelerated, for example, the digitalization of communications, but it has exposed not only the worst, but also the best. The so-called white flag movement, the degree of voluntarism, the heroism of the frontline workers, and so on and so forth. All this is something to be spoken for. But I think it's useful for us to consider for one moment that there are important options. And unfortunately, we have just seen the Ministry of Education cancelling one of the most important initiatives of recent times, cancelling the school feeding program. It's very unfortunate. We over a century after Japan first introduced school feeding for all children, regardless of means and so on and so forth, there's a certain degree of participation in the school feeding program which is very equitable, which creates a kind of new ethos, which is very important for future generations. We see this in Japan, we see this in many other societies, but unfortunately this has been cancelled. But the reason I feel very passionately about this is because the way school feeding has been handled so far, it has been handled in the old way, where you have one ministry, the Ministry of Education, for instance, undertaking school feeding program, giving major contracts to large food supply companies, regardless of the nutrition content of the food. There are many studies, Dr. Faizal knows this, but others do as well. There are many studies which have shown that although human life expectancy has increased tremendously, mainly because of what Dr. Zakiah talked about earlier, the improvements in terms of women's and child and infant mortality due to a number of reforms which were introduced in the 60s and 70s. What we have seen has been there has been a slowdown in the improvements in terms of life expectancy, and the major problem is food related non-communicable diseases, diabetes, and so on and so forth. Instead, we have seen for a long time the subsidization of sugar consumption, for example, which is now recognized not to be responsible for a whole range of health problems, not just diabetes. But we see, as a consequence of this, we see that the school feeding program, which was proposed by a former Deputy Prime Minister and implemented by the former Education Minister, which was designed to have a cooperation between the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture. So you would have basically farmers in this country who are at wit's end now trying to deal with a variety of ecological problems, finding new ways of moving forward, for instance, by producing far more vegetables and fruits, which would significantly contribute to the improvement of food programs. So the possibility of doing so, unfortunately, has been negated temporarily. But I think what we know, as Dr. Ernesto Guevara said many years ago, I think over half a century ago, he said that change comes about precisely because of the great feelings of love, of charity. And thanks to Yayasan Hasanah for reminding us of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Jomo. And, I think for me personally, it was very interesting to hear both the historic background in terms of how the country has developed, how the constitution was made, keeping inclusivity, keeping equity in mind, and where we are and some of the challenges today, especially with regards to the school feeding program and how is that at odds with what we are discussing today. So really looking forward to delving deeper into this in the question and answer segment. But let me now turn to Mr. Leong Cheung, not last, but definitely not the least. For the audience, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charities Trust is one of the biggest grant makers, if not the biggest grant maker in Asia. And I'm extremely happy here to welcome Leong to share with us, from as we talk about equity, as we talk about equality, how does one of the largest philanthropic institutions address that? And what has been the Hong Kong Jockey Club's sort of new initiatives and responses to the pandemic? Leong, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Naina, and thank you for the Hasanah Forum's invitation. I'm really honored to be here. So I know time is running short, so I would perhaps just cut into the content right away. So next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit of background of the Hong Kong Jockey Club. It is a very unique organization in Hong Kong. It has been around for close to 140 years, so we survived the colonial time, as well as today, the one country, two systems. Now, the Hong Kong Jockey Club, very interestingly, is a not-for-profit organization. So there is no shareholder, but being the nature of not-for-profit, indeed, it actually generates a lot of profit. So it is actually the largest taxpayer in Hong Kong. So we pay up to about 6 to 7% of the inland revenue income every year in Hong Kong. And also in the meantime, we are the largest charities trust foundation in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. Yeah, and for that matter, if you were to look at sort of the ranking in terms of annual giving, we have always been within the top 10 globally. So, so in the last few years, we rank up to about $550 million of annual giving in Hong Kong. So, but then our donation is pretty much focused just in Hong Kong. So it's a one location, one city focus foundation. So next slide, please. In the last 6 years, we went through a transformation, if you will, and really, I guess, transform ourselves to become a more proactive and strategic funder. So how do we qualify that? The way we understand it is that we are now more issue-based. We think about youth. We think about the challenge to our aging society. We think about sports. We think about arts, culture, and heritage. In the recent strategic discussions, we gradually moved to another 4 areas. We continue to have youth, but then we broaden it up to children and youth because we feel like early childhood development is very critical, very important, but has always been ignored in some sense in Hong Kong. And then also elderly, we call it positive aging now, as you see the population changes and the composite of it. So for example, 5 years ago, only 15% of the Hong Kong population age 65 or above had a higher than high school degree. But today, the number is more like 30%. And in another 5 years' time, it will be about 40%. So the way we think about the age people, in a sense, the older people, that concept has to change because the financial capabilities, the perspective in the world, and the capability of mastering digital devices will be all very different. So we ought to be prepared and be able to serve that up-and-coming population as well. And we're also thinking about healthy community, and we're thinking about talent and capacity building as well. So next slide, please. So very quickly, in the last 6 years, what we have done, I think in a way, we put in a lot of discipline in thinking about the impact that a foundation can generate. So on a high level, we summarize them into 3 layers of impact. So one is on individual empowerment. So how are we serving and how many are we serving at the individual level? So that level, in the last 6 years, we donated over $3.5 billion to benefit over 45 million. That's a huge number, but really we're looking at the 2.9 million who we call the high impact beneficiaries. So these are very closely impacted. So for example, the autistic children who went through our curriculum, who went through a support program. So those, we categorize them into the 2.9 million. Now, the second layer of impact we call, it is an institution level transformation or enhancement. So these are the support professionals. These are the teachers, other volunteers, other carers in the family. So similarly, if I were to take the example of autistic children, so in that program, for example, on direct beneficiaries, on the individual empowerment, we are serving about 70%, so close to 7,000 of autistic children in Hong Kong on an annual basis. On the capacity level institution enhancement, we have trained in the last 6 years 500 social workers, 5,000 teachers, and close to 10,000 parents. Now, the parents, they are there for the children for a long time. So even if the charities money dried up, these capacities, they will remain, be it the social workers, the teachers, all the parents. Last one, the last layer we call is really a system level. We call them system change. So similarly, if I were to take the autistic kids example, in that program, in 6 years' time, we help the sector develop a comprehensive curriculum and also an approach to better support the autistic children in the mainstream school. So that whole program, as a total package, has been adopted by the government into a policy, into an education policy, which was just implemented September this year. So now we don't need to spend further charities dollar into supporting the program. The government will. But what we'll continue to do is then to invest our further money into technologies. Can AI help support autistic children better? Can we generate more data insight from all these programs? Can we generate a digital platform to better facilitate the efficiency of the delivery of the program? So these, I think, as a foundation, we feel like this is a better role for us to, be the pioneer, take the risk, be flexible, and work with all the partners that I just mentioned, academias, the NGO sectors, the schools, governments. I will come to business later, but I think this is a role whereby we can convene, we can put together a trusted platform whereby everyone can work on to deliver these 3 layers of impact. So next couple of slides, I will try to also use COVID, as I think many people talk about COVID, to just illustrate some other examples very quickly with you. So next slide, please. Right, and the next slide, please. So COVID hit us February 2020, so last year. It still feels like a long time, but it's really just last year. But, I think as a foundation, very quickly, what we did was within the first week, we call about 200 of our active grantees. We call every one of them. No one was left behind. So basically try to deliver a few messages. One is that, as some of you may be familiar with the foundation work, we always have a set of KPIs that we want projects or grantees to deliver. So first message we delivered was, don't worry about the KPIs. We understand this is a very challenging time. So we are your partners. We're not here to squeeze you out on these KPIs. Now, secondly, of course, we ask how further can we help, in terms of the organization and also in terms of the people that these organizations support. So at the end, we took in a lot of different messages and inputs, and we finally set up 2 different funds for different purposes. But these 2 funds add up to about $30 million. And through the 2 funds, very quickly in the first few months, we make close to 400 grants and to about 300 organizations. A lot of them grassroots organizations, and a lot of them even we didn't work with before, but they support perhaps a small block of neighborhood with the materials, with mental support, and etc. So that we have been able to do it in a very agile way in the first few months. And then we also think about how creativity can work in some of these situations, and how can we work with also business partners, for example. So, it's a very busy slide, I understand. I think you can refer back to it later if you are interested. But I will quote a couple of examples. So one is what we call the bandwidth support. So again, in February, March last year, very quickly schools were closed and students are encouraged to learn from home. As you can imagine, a lot of the underprivileged children in the living environments they were in, they didn't have broadband. So a lot of them ended up using their parents' SIM card to get online. And very quickly, the data plan ran out after 1 or 2 Zoom sessions. So we actually put together a program. We work with all the 4 mobile carrier in Hong Kong. All of them jump on board very, very quickly. So they offer, the package at price or at cost or slowly below cost. We put up the money and we very quickly distributed 100,000 SIM cards, 30 gigs a month. So hopefully that's enough for class learning, not enough for game playing. But we very quickly supported 100,000 underprivileged kids so that they can learn from home. So that program we ran from March to July, right before summer. And then again, very luckily, the government then pick it up over the summer. So the government started to offer it September the last year. So now it becomes a regular support during pandemic, right? The other example I will quickly quote is food assistance. I mean, I think different speakers talk about food assistance. So it's very interesting. I mean, food assistance generally gives people a very traditional kind of sense, right? So you come down to a center, either it's hot meal or a package of food, and you fall in line and you get those foods, and then you either eat there or you go home. Now, all of these has to change during pandemic, right? You can't really come down and line up. Sorry, it's the center could be closed. And then we want to limit the number of people in the same location. You want to limit, social interactions and etc. So what we did at that time, there are a couple of very interesting ideas I'd like to share. One is we actually work with the 3 delivery business in Hong Kong. I won't name the names. Don't do an advertisement for them. But there are only 3 delivery platforms in Hong Kong. So we work with them, and the program basically facilitated people with different disabilities. So they cannot really, it's very difficult for them to come up, right? So the food now, they can just log on, they order whatever food they like within a certain limit, and the food will be delivered to their home. So especially good for fragile elderly people, especially good for people with disabilities. We also then work with one supplier to then develop a new machine. It's basically a vending machine. But instead of, a carbonated drink coming out, it is a chill food package. Now that becomes extremely popular, actually, among especially the underprivileged, because not only it served its purpose during pandemic by reducing or sort of the social distancing concept, it is 24/7. It also reduces stigma. You don't need to fall in line to wait for it. You are given a card, given you credit, then you just go to the machine, you put on the machine, and the food come out. Very easy to reheat at home. So I think, again, I would like to say, for whatever alliances, effective alliances we will try to build, to me, I think trust and innovation is very important. How we can build the trust so that we can all convene certain things to happen. But in the meantime, how we can use digital technology, how we can be creative in thinking about these relationships to make them more efficient so that it can happen. I think that would be very, very important going forward. So my last couple of slides very quickly in 30 seconds. Next slide, please. I won't go through this slide. It's just give you more examples. So the next slide, please. I think then coming to trust and innovation, we also joined this platform. In fact, we were invited by the SDSN network to start the Hong Kong chapter to deploy SDG into a lot of our work. We then also invite a university to join as co-host of the network. So I think through forums like this one currently happening, and through forums and platforms like the SDSN, I think we can enhance further the trust and also the creativity into doing good. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leong. I mean, I think you brought a very, very balanced perspective to our discussion today, especially, about talking about trust, talking about how do we work in partnership. I also want to really thank the audience, both who have been actually flooding our chat box with a lot of questions. So I'm going to, get straight into questions. But before I hand it over to, questions from the audience, I wanted to start off by asking Leong a question. You provided us a really good perspective of what countries outside Malaysia are doing. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of your experience with the Hong Kong Jockey Club, how has philanthropy partnered with government? Before you, the other speakers talked about the alliance between, the government, public sector, private sector, civil society. What is it that you are seeing from your vantage point in Hong Kong? Is it reflective of what you heard today in terms of what is happening in the Malaysian landscape?
Right. Of course, I can't really comment on the Malaysian landscape, but I think in Hong Kong, at least we work very closely with the government. I think the role that we respect each other and the way we work together is really that, we generally take a more pioneering role. So we try to pilot different initiatives. So for example, the autism example I just gave, the fact was that, we 6 years ago, we noticed there is a certain gap, in the way the current education system is supporting autistic children. So teachers, they were trained, but trained not enough. So a lot of teachers, when there is a autistic kid in the classroom, they found it very difficult to handle. Now, the whole education system has a very, very good policy to say, yeah, social inclusion in the mainstream education is very important. But, when it comes to the last mile in the delivery, I think sometimes policy falls short of the last mile. So I think this is the space and time philanthropy can come into play, right? We come in not in the form of, advocating a certain right and say governments should do this and that, but we say, let's build some evidence around some approach. Right? So that's how we started 6 years ago. We built with actual, we worked with one university, 6 NGOs. We piloted first initially in 100 schools. We try to then also use data and to try to inform evidence. And then we continue to communicate with the government. I think that create a very good cycle of learning. So both sides can say, yeah, when the government take on asset policy, they will be able to say, yeah, I am using public money, very, very critical. I'm using public money responsibly because I have looked at all these pilot results and very credible evidence. And then I'm putting public money to use in that sense. I think that's probably a good way how philanthropy can work constructively with the government.
Thank you. You bring in a very important point of using public money credibly. And, here I want to bring in Dato Faizal into the conversation in terms of, Leong talked about it from a grant-making organization, and you're here representing Mercy Malaysia, which is a large non-profit. How do you see Mercy Malaysia's role in terms of working with government, towards making a more just, making a more inclusive society? What is the kind of role that you see Mercy in particular, but civil society at large, playing in building this more inclusive society? How closely do you think the partnership with government needs to be, and what are some of the challenges that you feel happens between civil society and government when they need to come together? Sorry, we can't hear you. Just technical support. Do you think you could just help us? We can't hear Dato Ahmad. It's still not working. So let me, while they fix your technical issues, let me bring in Puan Zakiah and then, Prof. Jomo in as well. There is, Puan Zakiah, not to put you on the spot as the sole government representative here. I think you've been very, very candid about the issues that Malaysia faces, and especially the issues that the 2022 budget is seeking to address. But I think one of the questions that has come about, not just in terms of in terms of what I want to ask you, but there is a lot of questions that have come in from the audience in terms of the role of government and business coming together. You talked a little bit about in your presentation that initially there was a lot of focus on the private sector in terms of helping Malaysia progress together. But, you know, in the 2022 budget and going forward, the government has chosen to sort of also focus on civil society and the non-profit sector. So I think the question that I have is, how do you see government and private sector working together? And I think it's been reiterated by numbers of our audience who are asking about what is the best way of getting corporates to look at being more sustainable, to actually build a company culture that is more equitable, that is more focused on a sustainable growth.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Naina. Again, I think it's all about approach. For the Malaysian government, it's always giving out carrots. But I think when it comes to reforms, especially when it refers to sustainability agenda, both a carrot and stick approach may be a better way. We have seen how this works in countries, our benchmark countries, that seems to get this in place. So as I mentioned just now, the sticks are coming actually, whether we like it or not. Even within Malaysia next year, there will be a climate change law introduced to ensure that our industries will be more sustainable. But even if we don't have that law, now more and more allocators of capital, banks, and in the capital market, they're all going towards more sustainable investments, whether we like it or not. And again, as I mentioned just now, 70% of our exports goes to countries that have some sustainability targets. Europe will introduce the cross-border carbon tax soon in 2026. We have barely 5 years to prepare for that. So now what the government is doing is giving these incentives for the change. But the change must be organic. The corporate sector must want to change and have to change if we want to stay in business in future.
Thank you, Puan Zakiah. Prof. Jomo, let me bring you in. I have an interesting question from the audience, which is actually addressed to both of you. And I'm going to just, it's from someone called Amir Go from the audience. And he's addressed the question to both yourself and Puan Zakiah. And the question is political clientelism, and I'm not sure what political clientelism is really, still a prevalent issue in Malaysia? And how does it inhibit the development agenda? And what can we do to minimize or eradicate this political clientelism within our own institutions and political culture? Let me ask Prof. Jomo first, and then Puan Zakiah, I'll bring you in.
Thank you very much. I think it's very difficult for a civil servant to answer that question. So let me try to. The fact is that ethno-populism in all contexts, Mr. Trump or the Prime Minister of India and so on and so forth, when you mobilize, it is essentially involves clientelism. And in this case, the clientelism involves, an appeal to particular ethnic or cultural or religious affinities. So that's fairly straightforward, and that's a given in Malaysia. The question is whether we want to go beyond that or not. I think that's the challenge before us. But what it actually means in this country, for example, is how things are presented. Okay, and this is where the development discourse becomes extremely important. The fact of the matter is that Malaysia has been, for the last quarter century, since 1998, has been involved in deficit spending. The debt has simply continued to grow from year to year, but the decisions are made by the political masters, right? Because everybody wants to get re-elected, so they just kick the can down the road and they don't impose taxes, especially if they are the ones who are going to be paying the taxes, right? So this happens all over the place. Look at what happened with Mr. Trump and what Biden has inherited. You try to do more in terms of economic recovery, but you can't do it because you are hamstrung by the fact that you do not have any fiscal resources to speak of. Now, the US is exceptional because you can borrow from the rest of the world, and there are always enough client states to buy US Treasury bonds and so on. But for countries like Malaysia, this becomes a serious problem. Nonetheless, I do see the need for what people call counter-cyclical spending. And this is certainly the case in 1998 when there was a great deal of increase in spending because of the Asian financial crisis. And this again, we see right now, given the nature of the pandemic slowdown. But the fact of the matter is that these problems existed even before. The pandemic just exposed them, and this I think is a problem which we need to begin to deal with. And much of this, of course, begins from the colonial period, because it was not the colonial corporate interests who were being taxed. Instead, the so-called taxes were on things like opium and gambling and so on, which affected the ordinary people, the so-called sin taxes. So you have in many colonies effectively the public subsidizing the colonial fiscal purse, okay? Whether it's India or Malaysia or Africa and so on and so forth. So there's a long history of this, and I think it is very difficult to understand this without understanding the underlying problems of injustice in our societies. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Prof. Jomo. Puan Zakiah, would you like to comment?
Yeah, yes, I would, but I have to be very delicate here. I have to ensure I still have a job tomorrow. Given the political landscape here now, I think we are in a growing pains of being politically mature. In the last 2 years, during the crisis, we have a change of government twice. On the civil, let me tell you how, at least on the civil service side, how are we managing that? In moving forward, we are trying to institutionalize many things. So it won't matter who is in power. So the core policies will be there. For instance, we will be embarking on a Fiscal Responsibility Act where to put in the governance, the transparency, all the fiscal parameters in. So it won't be that easy to change, some of the targets in future. You have to go to Parliament to do that. So these are some of the things we're going to put in place, to adjust to the political landscape. And, I'm happy to admit, in this administration, there is appetite for change, and there is an urgency to do that, especially we have now barely 8 months before the MOU ends. So we are also in a hurry to ensure that all these institutional reforms, the seats are already in place. So in the coming, inshallah, in the coming months, you will hear more announcements on this. We don't want to put all in the budget because we don't want to distract, all these reforms from the main messages of the budget. But inshallah, more reforms will be coming in. So I had to look up what political clientele is, but we hope that it will address, such issue. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you, Puan Zakiah, for being so candid. I mean, coming from a populist democracy myself, I can tell you that it is very, very hard to have development indices in place when you're looking to get re-elected and you're appealing to a certain segment of population irrespective. And maybe now I can try and bring Dato Faizal in. I hope your mic is working. You did talk, when you were presenting, and it really struck me in terms of what is the role and the space that civil society needs to play, and how do we encourage it without it being divisive. So given the fact that, we have a government, or we have governments that are becoming more and more populist across the world, the pandemic has resulted in a lot of governments across Singapore included, where I'm sitting right now, to be more inward looking, to be more focused on certain segments. How do we create a more robust role for civil society? And there is a question from the audience, which I think is directed to you, where Leong emphasized so much on capacity building to improve delivery and enable replication. How do civil society organizations like Mercy Corps look at building capacity, and how can they actually encourage more philanthropic organizations to help them build capacity? Oops, I don't think we can still hear you, unfortunately. I'm not sure what is going on. I'm so sorry. I think you're having problems with your mic, so I apologize. And let me move that conversation to everybody else in terms of how do we ensure, as we are sort of looking at one of the interesting things, actually, Prof. Jomo, that you brought up just now in the discussion was the fact that you have this whole syntax structure that we inherited from colonial times, and it's interesting you said that, because the Hong Kong Jockey Club's revenues, unfortunately or fortunately, come from syntax, the tax that is on the races that happen in Hong Kong, and I think they're able to use that really really quite well. Any thoughts on that, Prof. Jomo?
Well, I think, I without commenting on the Hong Kong Jockey Club, which I have no expertise in, but I think we have a big problem. Once a government gets too dependent on so-called sin taxes, you have a vested interest in collecting taxes, for example, from smoking, rather than trying to eliminate smoking in that society. This is a dilemma, or when you have your political clients, if I can reintroduce the term, getting licenses from opening vaping parlors. Those influential people have a vested interest in continuing vaping and tobacco consumption in other ways. So I think the big problem really is the ability to collect taxes. And there are some important changes which are going on in the world today, and the ability to spend judiciously. What we have seen in Malaysia since independence until now, my friend, the late Ismail Saleh, pointed out that Malaysian tax structure has actually been regressive. We all like to think that it's actually progressive. In fact, it is actually regressive from colonial times to the present. And it has become more regressive, arguably, since the mid-1980s. On the spending side as well, the only major study which has been done by Jacob Meerman some decades ago shows also that spending is also regressive. So in fact, we all like to think that the role of government is progressive, when in fact, it has often been regressive. And Malaysia is not alone in this respect. So we really need to begin to think very seriously about what the appropriate role of government and the appropriate relationship to the private sector. I mean, we have seen, for example, these so-called charitable foundations lobbying actively to strengthen intellectual property rights, which is a major impediment to making cheaper vaccines, cheaper therapies, cheaper treatments available to most of the world. And so we have a situation that just because people cannot afford to buy those vaccines and other treatments, they are not going to get them. So about almost half the countries in the world who are considered low-income countries haven't even signed up for COVAX and these other things because they simply cannot afford it. So we have a conspiracy a sort of conspiracy. It's not really a conspiracy, but as with people pursuing their personal, you actually stand in the way of actually achieving improvements in the human condition.
No, thank you for that. And, we have very little time left, so I'm going to end with the last question from the audience, which is actually quite a thought-provoking question, and I'm going to place it to all of the panelists. So Tawfiq Nazaruddin asks us as to why should the government invest more capital, resources, and platforms towards social security today? And what would be the big ideas or obstacles, in your views, in terms of potential action if they were to choose to invest more capital? And how important then is the role of entrepreneurs and the younger generation in undergoing transformative work. And I think it's followed up by a question from Sharizal Sharani, who talks about that earlier the Khazanah managing director mentioned that companies are about making money and increasing asset value. The question is whether this is a model we should incentivize, or should we incentivize company models that impact communities off the bat, such as social enterprises, and actually help them grow into big MNCs. And I think it leaps back into something what you said, Prof. Jomo, into what is the actual problem that you're addressing and how are you addressing it? If companies are the goal of companies is to make profit, are they really going to be looking at social progress and societal progress? So should governments be incentivizing the corporate sector, or should they be focusing much more on social entrepreneurs and social enterprises or companies that have social impact embedded in their business model? Let me start by asking Leong his thoughts, then we'll go to Puan, Zakiah, Prof. Jomo, and if Dato has his mic on, then we can end with him. So Leong, just quickly, 2 minutes.
Sure, thank you. This is more like a 20 days discussion, I guess. But I think, I think given the modern capitalist market economy, it is sort of a common thought that profit is the only driver. Of course, in recent years, you see in the world there is different concepts. CSV, create shareholder value. Create share value. You have ESG now. So in Hong Kong, for example, all the listed companies, they have to publish ESG report. I think in the investment world where I came from the private equity world, but even from the public equity world, there are now different principal investment guidelines and etc. I think we do need to, one is to establish some of these boundaries, if you will, to guide greed. But in the meantime, I think education continues to be a very important thing. I'm very glad that young people, they are asking these questions now. They say, shall I invest my career in a sustainability issue, or shall I invest my career in just making money for myself? So I think, you have to do it on both ends. So by education, and then also setting up, better rules, I think, that align with the destiny of humanity, not just for a small group of shareholders, making money in the shortest period of time, but really thinking broadly for more stakeholders.
Thank you. Puan, Zakiah, your thoughts? Should it be only looking at corporates, or should we be actually focusing on supporting other kinds of organizations?
The joy of government task is about balancing in everything. I don't think there's a clear cut, black and white, division between all. It's, the change towards a more sustainable life is real and necessary, but it need not be a complete 180 degrees change. We can incorporate the sustainability component in our daily life, in corporate, be it in corporate sector, community, in individuals. But change is must, and the government is helping society to do that. So I don't think it's no longer a choice. We have to change.
So change is not a choice. We have to change. It is up to all of us, whether we are a corporate, whether we are an individual. Prof. Jomo, what do you think? How do we hold government to account? How do we hold civil society to account? And how do we make sure that corporates do their bit?
Earlier, Dato Zakiah reminded us that the labor share of national income has actually been declining. When you consider that 4 to 5 million undocumented foreign workers are not even calculated as part of the labor force, the problem becomes even more alarming. We have also heard that the number of people, that only about 3% of the people who have accounts in the Employees Provident Fund in this country have enough to keep them above the poverty line once they stop working. And on and on. The list goes on and on. So the problem is that we either condone that kind of system, or you introduce checks and balances. Let's face it, capitalism is the only game in town, but there are a variety of capitalisms, as Mr. Cheung reminded us. And it is possible to discipline capitalists, because capitalists do not necessarily seek to enhance the public interest. Okay, they are doing what they are obliged to do to some extent. And it is therefore all the more reason why government has to introduce checks and balances, including, for example, making sure that those who evade taxation are punished. I mean, the fact of the matter is that this is a very, very serious problem, especially in developing countries. You know, you have a country like Tanzania where the public is actually subsidizing foreign gold mining companies to mine in Tanzania, you know, and because they're exempt from taxation and so on and so forth. So but things are changing. Things are changing. The question is in what direction we move. And unfortunately, we cannot look to the West for enlightenment in this direction. They are not moving in this direction. They are doing some things which are very interesting. For example, the whole idea of mobilizing all of society, all of the economy, the idea of a so-called mission economy and so on, which we need, for example, to be moving into areas where we do have a chance of becoming internationally competitive. Photovoltaic solar panels, for example, palm oil-based biodiesel, and so on and so forth. There are a whole list of things which have a chance. But you know, these things are not going to happen, are going to come about if you simply leave things to so-called market forces, because not everybody in the market is on a level playing field, as we have been reminded. So you really need to shape investment decisions. You also need to discipline capital, but at the same time, incentivize capital when they are doing the right things. And all that is very important.
Thank you. Absolutely. So I think, you know, firstly, I want to say thank you very much to all the panelists for a very engaging and insightful discussion. I would also like to thank Hasanah Foundation for introducing a really timely topic. I think, you know, we have to ask some of these questions. We need to introduce checks and balances, and there needs to be, you know, an open and vigorous debate between the different sectors for us to be able to move to a more equitable and a more equal society. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed the panel as much as I did moderating it. Thank you.